Okay, we're at the top of the hour. We'll get started. Again, I'm Joe Stewart, the Vice President for Governmental Affairs, the independent insurance agents in North Carolina. We're very fortunate today to be joined by Travis Fain, who's a former reporter, most recently with WRAL TV here in Raleigh, but has gone out on his own now and is doing some consulting and contract work, including some work with the North Carolina Alliance for Safe Transportation to help us with some of the initiatives that we have there. Travis, thanks for joining us today.
Hey, I'm glad to be here. Thanks for having me.
Two quick things before we get started. One, it may have been a typographical error that indicated that for your participation and viewership of this webinar, you'd get 3 hours of continuing education. That's not the case. You get 1 hour, and associated with the continuing education, a couple of times during the course of the webinar, there'll be an online poll that you need to take, and that's the way we have of determining that you actually are participating with the webinar to make it eligible for you to be given the 1 hour of continuing education credit. So make sure that when that poll pops up that you take whatever answer whatever the question is, so that we make sure that you get your continuing education credit. Brittany, any other issues from the professional development education program standpoint before we get started?
Nope, I think you covered all of it.
Great. Well, we thought we would take this occasion to update those of you that are interested in the 2024 elections here in North Carolina. We've done a couple of these already in the course of the election year. And as you can see from the URL that's listed on this first slide, IIANC.com 2024 /2024 elections. We've hosted all of the video interviews we've done with the candidates for insurance commissioner, as well as the video versions of all of the update webinars. This webinar is being recorded and will also be put on that webpage for anybody that wants to view it later. We'll push it out and make people aware of it so that anyone who was not able to join us today will be able to watch and get the most recent up-to-date insights on what's going on in North Carolina politics. Well, as a starting place, we've talked about this before, North Carolina considered a battleground state in the presidential contest. We've seen already some considerable amount of outside money coming into the state being spent in support of or opposition to various candidates. We started the election with the sense that our gubernatorial contest would be the #1 most competitive race. It's separated a little bit there in the polling, so it may not be as competitive a race, at least at this juncture. It doesn't look to be. It may tighten up a little bit as we get closer to election day. But so some interesting dynamics. No U.S. Senate race on the ballot this year, so maybe the turnout is modestly impacted by that, as top of the ballot, high profile races have a tendency to draw greater voter attention, and not having a U.S. Senate race this year might have that impact on the overall turnout. 4 seats, 1 in the state Supreme Court and 3 in the Court of Appeals, and our judicial system are on the ballot. All 14 of our congressional districts in all 170 of the legislative districts with new maps, different from the maps that the candidates ran in 2022 as a result of redistricting lawsuits. So a little bit of a different landscape in terms of the politics of the re-election campaigns for congressional and legislative seats. Real quickly, before we get started with the information on the specific races that we're following in this election cycle, I think it's important to understand part of the context of North Carolina's complexity from a voter profile standpoint is the dramatic changes that have taken place in recent decades in the demography of North Carolina. Here are the most recent voter registration statistics, and it gives you some sense of the dynamic changes that are taking place. These are the racial composition of registered voters, and when you register, you self-identify which category you believe you want to be placed in terms of your voter registration. The most dynamic of these, I think, two that are really important. One, about 4% of the state's registered voters are Hispanic, but 10% of the state's population is. There's a significant portion of voters that will come into their own in the next decade. Kids that were born here in North Carolina, mom and dad may not have been here lawfully, but they were born here, raised in North Carolina as North Carolinians, and when they turn 18 will have voting rights as a result of having been born here. Not that there's anything unusual about that, just North Carolina doesn't have a political history of having a significant second generation population of voters in quite this way. And as you can see from some of the other categories, other and multi, and there's a changing sense of what this demography might mean, principally among younger generation Americans who don't necessarily feel like they fit neatly into racial or ethnic categories that older generation of Americans have considered. The considerable percentage of North Carolina's young people that are born into a family where at least one of their parents was born in some country other than the United States, a phenomena, as you can see from the map there. The darker blue colors, more than 12% of the young people in those particular counties have at least one foreign-born parent. And then the chart showing the point of origin for folks that have come from other countries into North Carolina. The largest concentration of the children of immigrants being, of course, in the major metropolitan counties of Wake and Mecklenburg. Probably no surprise there, but a little bit of a distribution along that I-85, I-40 corridor in North Carolina in terms of the emerging demographic trends in North Carolina. And then the growth patterns sort of similarly suited. This will change and continue to change North Carolina's political landscape as we have increasing urban centers, Raleigh and Charlotte, in the area between the two. That 180-mile stretch will become an incredibly important part of the state politically, simply because the vast majority of registered voters will live within that corridor. You see here the far western counties and the southeastern and northeastern counties. Some significant portion of the growth in those parts of the state is being driven by retirees moving in. So the demography, even though the population is increasing, the demography of that growth is slightly different than it is in the rest of the state. The best example, Brunswick County, there that adjoins New Hanover, the Wilmington area, is the oldest state. The average age in Brunswick is the oldest of any county in North Carolina. It is the fastest growing county on a per capita basis. So that's just an example. It's not sort of even in terms of the way the growth patterns are emerging, or even what the constituted portions of those growth patterns are made up of. And this growth is continued to expect it to be mostly in the urban areas of the state, principally in the Research Triangle area and the Charlotte metropolitan area. We'll see the greatest growth over the next few decades. The implications for that, this is where the politics hits it. This is from a political consultant, Paul Shoemaker, who works with Republican candidates, but Paul's provided this, and it's an assessment based on polling that he's done, not on registration, but what the person said they felt their partisan identity was, Democrat, Republican, or unaffiliated, and then their chosen identity in terms of ideology. And so the top line shows where self-identified Republicans have been on an ideological basis. And you can see in this chart, it's sort of a 0 would be perfectly moderate. As the numbers are positive, it's more conservative. As the numbers are negative, they're more liberal. But going back into the mid-1990s, you see there again, also in the chart, you'll see what the average is, the line purple. That what identified overall the ideological disposition of registered voters in North Carolina. So you'd see, going back to the mid-90s, the state was a right-center state overall ideologically. Republicans were more conservative, but Democrats were, in effect, conservative as well. And so the distinction of partisan identity wasn't necessarily an absolute identifier in terms of an individual's ideology. And as you follow the chart forward to the most recent election cycle, Paul did this in 2022, you can see that self-identified Democrats have gone now below the horizontal axis and are consider themselves liberals. They become left of center in terms of their ideological disposition. The state as a whole remains somewhat right of center ideologically. Republicans not changing much in terms of their self-identified ideological disposition. And unaffiliated voters, more or less, have remained more or less consistent with what the overall average was for the state in terms of partisan identity and ideology. Travis?
One thing on that one, yeah. So what does it mean to be a conservative in 2024, I think, is the question that this chart suggests to me. And how do people go about agreeing on that definition? Of course, you could say the same thing for liberal, but with the impact that Donald Trump has had on the Republican Party and on conservatives in general, I think if you asked 10 members of the Republican Party, what does it mean to be a conservative, you would get, at least 50% different answers.
Interesting. Yeah, I think that's absolutely the case. And then just sort of whimsically, this is a chart that was produced based on the demography of the consumer base for these particular eating establishments, and then matching that up against what we know from a measure of politics, their ideology and partisan registration and performance as voters, meaning their likelihood to actually go out and cast a ballot. All of the restaurants and the size of the bubble represents the portional amount of market share that establishment has in the overall restaurant business in the United States. So you can see things that are sort of interesting to consider. Wendy's and McDonald's, not likely, the consumer base, not likely to be an indication of far more or less political identity or likelihood of voting. Bob Evans, Panera, Cracker Barrel, you see far more likely to be a Republican, far more likely to vote. Popeyes, Golden Corral, TGI Fridays, Chuck E. Cheese, more Democratic in their disposition, but less likely to vote. I'm not sure this really means anything, Travis, but I think this way of projecting what Americans begin to see as their self-identity from a partisan and political standpoint and how it affects their consumer choices. Maybe that's what it says.
Oh, and it also tells you where these companies choose to build their businesses, right? Because based on what we know about kind of political segregation throughout different parts of the state.
Okay, as a starting point, I have what I call the surfer theory of elections. You have the candidate, in effect, the surfer, and the question is, how do voters feel about that person? Then you have the board, which is the campaign. And I like to say that a superior surfer can ride an inferior board successfully, or an inferior surfer can be carried by a very superior board successfully. And sometimes it's just the wave. And that is, in effect, a significant part of the dynamics, particularly in close elections, the qualifications and experience and ability of the candidates, the proficiency of the people running the campaign. Sometimes it's just the dynamics of the elections that make a bigger difference. And we see this a lot in what are called wave elections, generally midterm elections, where one party or the other is favored just because of the disposition of voters in that particular election cycle. The relative ability of the candidate or the campaign may not matter as much, but I'm not sure that's quite at play in this election, Travis. I think it's just tight. People are baked into their position. They support their candidates. They're against the other person, and they're not movable.
Yeah, it's so difficult, I think, at least once people know about the candidates. I think in some of the polling we'll talk about later, there's still a lot of undecideds. But yeah, I heard someone say yesterday, and I wish I remember who it was because I thought it was wonderful, talking about consulting and about public opinion and about communications. Good communication won't make up for bad actions. And the same is true of a candidate. Like you can only campaign so much if it up or down from where your candidate quality actually is.
Okay, we started this election and it looked very likely to be a Donald Trump, Joe Biden matchup. We remember just a few months ago now, after a very bad debate performance in Atlanta, Joe Biden, after a few tortured weeks of discussion and debate, decided to withdraw from the race. At that juncture, it really did look like it was Donald Trump versus the old man. And then with Kamala Harris emerging as the Democratic nominee and then being nominated by our party formally, now Donald Trump is the old man in many ways. And so the role has shifted a little bit. What the Harris campaign was able to accomplish, at least initially, was about a 180-degree pivot from where the Biden campaign was in terms of the enrollment of young people, the utilization of social media, getting social media influencers, young celebrities to come on board and make public pronouncements of support for Kamala Harris. That was really the hallmark and what built a perception of enthusiasm and momentum for the Harris campaign, at least initially following the Democratic National Convention. What the post-convention bump is usually good for 3 to 5 percentage points in terms of the popularity of that party's candidates. And that seems to more or less have been what it was. But so far, the distinguishing characteristics seem to be that the Harris campaign is getting young people enthusiastic about the race, Travis.
Yeah, and Trump did not help himself in that debate, which I looked up this morning. Something like 60 million people watched that debate, which is real. That's a real number. I saw, look, Twitter is not real life, but I saw a lot of posts on Twitter, the classic Simpsons line of old man yells at cloud, people tagging Trump with that. And I think that's just for a lot of people how he came across. So I would think he would want to try to break out of this, but so far no signs that he's going to be able to do that or that he has been able to do that so far.
Yeah, the former president and current vice president met in a debate this week. We didn't include that in the slide because it seemed like the more significant event in the course of the week was right after the debate. Taylor Swift announced that she was endorsing the vice president for president. And this was something that had been speculated. I included that as a potential phenomenon in previous presentations. The sort of the calculus, the CNN story that's on the screen now, the actual number of voters that may get excited and enrolled in this election, maybe not as big mathematically as people think it might be, but Taylor Swift still an enormously significant cultural iconic figure to get involved in a presidential contest, Travis.
Yeah, I think this makes some difference. One of the things that it may do, as opposed to affecting voting, is some of the Swifties may say, "All right, now I'm going to volunteer for the campaign. I was thinking about knocking on doors. I was thinking about phone banking, and now Taylor Swift has pushed me just a little bit further, and I'm going to do that sort of work," which of course has a multiplier effect.
And so where we see him in the presidential contest on a national level is really it appears that Harris has the momentum, and momentum matters a lot, but it's not the only thing that matters. The Harris campaign has a somewhat significant campaign finance advantage, cash on hand, though both campaigns have relatively large war chests that they will spend between now and election day. A lot of outside group spending will matter as well. But Travis, what you said is sort of a sense of enthusiasm that's come back among Democrats, a greater willingness to participate as volunteers, to get out and register voters. And so at this point, we're looking at the campaigns in terms of how effectively they continue to keep their base voters enthusiastic and motivated to actually turn out. It's one thing to say you support a candidate, and it's another thing entirely to go out and vote. And so I think a lot of the emphasis in the presidential campaign is going to be around this issue of keeping their base voters enthusiastic and exciting.
Yeah, and I wonder in the future, I don't know how you would do this, but does it make sense for either party to decide we're going to start our presidential race a little later? This idea has always been, well, let's start, the candidates want to start early and they want to build in some of the early states. And I guess that's just part and parcel of the primary process, maybe no way around it. But boy, there's an advantage that I don't think I had thought through to kind of coming out of nowhere and being like, oh, I'm the candidate now. You don't have to hold that intensity as long, that's for sure.
It really is remarkable to think up until the mid to the first third of the 20th century in American politics, it was seen and considered unseemly for a presidential candidate to campaign for themselves. They would sit in their front porch, on the front porch of their home, in whatever home state they were in. People could come see them, but they would not travel anywhere in the United States. And the campaigns were really limited until the election year. You didn't start campaigning for president until January 1st of the election year. It's a very different dynamic now, Travis.
It really is. Yeah.
Okay, the North Carolina ballot, we had 7 candidates for president, but there was litigation most recently. Robert F. Kennedy had filed the requisite number of signatures on a petition to be added to North Carolina's ballot as a presidential contest, and then he didn't want to be on anymore, Travis.
Yeah, and first of all, if you were like 7 and then you said, who are some of these people? Now you don't have to worry that's fine. You should not feel bad about that. I didn't know a couple of those names. It'll be interesting to see what the RFK impact is there. Obviously, he's sued to get on the ballot, and then he's sued to get off the ballot, and he is going to be off the ballot. You would think that helps Trump a little bit, and a little bit might be enough for Trump to win the state to the extent that he needed help to win the state. I mean, we tend to be a pink state, particularly in presidential elections.
Well, here's the results from the 2020 contest. We saw that Roy Cooper, who was running for re-election in that race, won by a larger margin than the Donald Trump did in the presidential contest. The phenomena of people that voted for Donald Trump, the Republican candidate for president, then voted for Roy Cooper, the Democratic candidate for governor. Not unprecedented in North Carolina politics, but maybe the margins by which that occurred in the last election cycle are slightly larger. And I guess the question, Travis, are there Trump-Stein voters? Josh Stein being the Democratic nominee for governor.
I think probably not near as many as there were Trump Cooper voters. I think that's for a handful of reasons. One of them was Cooper's reelection was during, at least in 2020, was during a pandemic. There's a don't change horses midstream kind of mentality there for a governor, particularly when Dan Forrest, who was running the Republican nominee in 2020, was running on such a different platform when it came to pandemic response than Roy Cooper. Like I said before, I think we're a pink state, so we tend to vote for Republicans, but the state Republican Party has really struggled to put forward electable statewide candidates, particularly in those governor's races. We'll talk, I'm sure, a little bit about Mark Robinson in a bit. It's really tough, and candidate quality really matters. So I don't see a lot of Trump Stein voters. I also don't think Stein has the advantage that Cooper had of rural support. Chris Cooper, no relation to Governor Cooper. Chris Cooper is a political scientist at Western Carolina University, and he said on a show, I heard Tim Boyum's podcast the other day, that the difference for Cooper has largely been that he runs slightly better in rural areas than other Democrats. So he doesn't win rural areas, but he loses them by less, and that's been enough for Cooper to kind of rise up above what you would normally see for numbers for a Democrat. It's going to be interesting with him term limited. Where do Democrats make up those numbers? I know that Anderson Clayton, the new head of the state Democratic Party, is really pushing to boost numbers in rural areas and with young people, as always. And I'll wrap on this, but look over the next month or so what happens with voter registration figures in counties with college campuses. Laura Leslie at WRAL, one of my former colleagues, mentioned that at your Thinkers Luncheon the other day, Joe, that we shall see some of that Anderson Clayton impact with voter registration numbers coming out of college campuses now that the semester has started.
Well, and this is showing in real vivid the implications of urbanization in terms of how it influences voter turnout. Going back to the 2020 elections, the counties that Joe Biden, the Democratic candidate for president, won in 2020, the average population density of those counties about 500, and even in the counties that Biden won by 20 percentage points or more, exceeded that 500 number. Trump, the populational density in those counties, just under 150 people per square mile. This is consistent across American congressional districts, typically with 500 or more people per square mile, the tendency to elect Democrats more consistently. And the reflection of this is, as North Carolina continues to grow and urbanize, an increasingly smaller and smaller and smaller number of counties will constitute half of the voters. I mean, half of the voters now in 13, maybe 12 counties. We may see that number shrink to 11, 10, 9. And so for a statewide candidate to win, they have to win overwhelmingly in just a handful of the counties. And it sort of shifts the balance of power in the legislature, because the maps for the state Senate and state House are drawn on a portional basis, each district being more or less equal. If you have a large concentration of people in a relatively small area, you're going to have a lot of legislative districts because the number of people in the district has to be the same. Or rural parts of the state, the districts will be very large geographically to try to capture the requisite number of people that are needed. It just means there are more urban and suburban oriented legislators in the General Assembly. Okay, getting to the polling. This is the aggregation of all publicly available polls for the state of North Carolina in a head-to-head matchup between Donald Trump and Kamala Harris. And you can see from the time that Joe Biden dropped out of this race in North Carolina closed considerably and is, for all intents and purposes, at a dead heat right now, Travis.
Yeah, and I think this is kind of what we expected. If Biden had not performed so disastrously and just been clearly too old to run, this is probably what it would look like there too. But Harris has energized things, and I don't expect this to look much different between now and November 5th. I think it'll be a very tight race. Probably Trump wins by a point or two.
Then looking at the Electoral College map of the United States, this is just based on the polling data that's out there now. About 6 or 7 states that are considered to be up for grabs for either campaign. And at any point over the last several weeks, they've gone one way or the other in terms of the polling, this and that. But again, a very, very competitive race for president. May come down to just a few tens of thousands, maybe just less, slightly less than 100,000 people total that decide who the next president of the United States is, and the competitions in these battleground states, Travis.
Yeah, and one of the things we've heard for years is that Republicans can't win the presidency without winning North Carolina. It'll be interesting to see if that starts to shift a little bit. And then as I look at this map and I look at the shade of pink in Florida, and I look at the number of electoral college votes in Florida, if I'm a Democrat, look, obviously a lot of things can change in 4 and 8 years. But as I look out to 2028 to 2032, given the numbers involved, I am thinking very hard about finding a Democrat who can flip Florida. which has been, pretty reliably read in recent cycles, but maybe starting to change. I don't know what the demographic shift looks like there, like which way we're trending and how fast. But just looking at that map, that's where my brain goes to.
And then looking at the issues, the economy remains an important issue to most of the voters in this country. People feeling as though the state of the economy is not good necessarily. Their perceptions based on, I guess, their own individual sense of economic standing, their prospects for the future, how confident they are they'll continue to do well as a family. And it seems to me, Travis, that the answer to the question for Donald Trump, what does it take to win? If he can convince voters to remain focused on economic issues, crime, criminal justice, and border security, that those are issues that generally voters have a tendency to think he, as the Republican nominee, is better suited to deal with. The question is, does he have the capacity as a candidate to exert the kind of discipline necessary to remain focused on just those issues?
Right. It's the economy stupid, but all he hears is the word stupid, and then he gets really mad and starts yelling at everybody, right? Look, what this chart tells me is that we have been trying to talk ourselves into a recession for 4 years. I remember as a reporter sitting on the Senate floor and the House floor talking to legislative budget writers about how they were preparing for a recession in the next 9 months. And this was, 3.5 years ago. And it just hasn't come. So much of how we make decisions is based on sentiment because we cannot predict the future, obviously. Inflation obviously remains a problem, particularly with groceries. Although I will say I paid $2.80, give or take, for gasoline per gallon the other day. And I noticed it. I was like, oh, it's below $3. I feel like it's been a while on that. So what that looks like 1 month from now could be a very big deal in this election.
Yeah, in that question of can something occur between now and November 5th that dramatically alters the political landscape, the answer is yes. And I use this news story. Iran clearly upset and angry about the circumstances that occurred with the Israeli secret effort to detonate a device that killed a Hamas leader while they were in Tehran. There had been an attack on Israel a few months back. Iran had launched a number of missiles towards Israel, but had notified them in advance that it was happening. And so most of them were able to be shot down. I think it was a display of political brinksmanship without the intention of causing real harm. I don't know that the Iranians feel that same level of reservation at this point. I did notice in the news clips this morning, North Korea launched some missiles this morning too. So can world events overtake what voters perceive as the most important issues from an economic and national, internal security standpoint, Travis? Do you think if we had an event, global event, a significant act of terrorism, something like that, would that alter the landscape?
There's a lot of wild cards in the world, right? And they all kind of bounce off of each other, and we don't really understand how it all comes together. But yeah, and what if there is some sort of event, what does that make everybody think? Do they want the strong man, quote unquote, in Donald Trump? Do they want the maybe steadier, more predictable policy of a Kamala Harris? I don't know. I kind of would guesstimate they would go more toward the strongman Trump, even if that doesn't quite make sense given the way he has spoken about dictators around the globe.
Is it possible, Travis, in your opinion, if something was to happen? I mean, Kamala Harris is still a part of the Biden administration. If voters perceived that the White House wasn't dealing with an international incident exceptionally well, or wasn't responding in a manner that people felt was appropriate, whatever that set of circumstances might be, do you think voters would hold Kamala Harris accountable for the actions of Joe Biden at this point?
Probably, his administration. I mean, they're rightly and wrongly, right? I mean, she's part of the administration. She is, the second highest office in the land. The thing is, the second highest office in this land doesn't have a ton of power, particularly as far as setting the stage for foreign policy. And look, this is a hard world. Things go wrong. Things go sideways. It's very difficult to sift through all the priorities and make sound decisions.
So in my estimation, people are pretty entrenched at this point. The cake may be baked a little bit in terms of folks have made their decision who they're going to vote for, and probably just as important, they've decided they're against the other person, and that's not going to change. There's a tiny percentage of voters in North Carolina and nationally who are influenceable in terms of this race. It can have their minds changed in terms of who they support. A lot of times campaigns are looking for the silver bullet approach, and generally speaking, as my father once astutely said, you're looking for a silver bullet, you'd probably be better served with 6 lead ones. And so we'll see if the campaigns can figure out what is the right message set for these undecided voters leading up to election day. I don't know if any of you have seen the streaming series Fallout, but that you use this example of it back in the 1950s, that if you held up your thumb when the nuclear blast occurred, if you held up your thumb and the mushroom cloud was smaller than your thumb, you had a chance to get away, and so you should run. But if the mushroom cloud was bigger than your thumb, it was over. And so some ways our politics has gotten that way. People are looking at the candidates and saying, do I hate this one candidate so badly that I will vote for the other candidate? As much as anything, people's antagonism towards one that drives them to vote, not necessarily they support one candidate over the other, but they dislike one candidate over the other. And so this little tiny percentage of voters that are still out there, whatever the issue sets are, the public policy stew, it could be any combination of these things, or one thing that really matters and motivates a particular member of this constituency of undecided and available voters to be picked up by one campaign or the other. It may not be abundantly clear to us, and the micro-targeting campaigns do attempt to try to reach those voters on issues that matter to them. But Travis, can you tell at this point, is there any way to predict what that tiny portion of undecided voters are likely to be motivated by here in the final
No,
weeks?
I spent many years standing outside of polling locations and interviewing people as they came out about who they voted for and why they voted that way. You don't have to do that very long before you just throw up your hands and say, okay, I not only can I not figure this all out, maybe I just don't want to know.
All right. Well, an important constituency in this election, younger voters, a significant portion of registered voters now are youngest generation Americans. They don't vote as consistently as older Americans, but numerically they are a very big group of people. And the question is, how motivated, excited, and enthusiastic are they to actually vote? Do they feel like they had a choice? And some part of the challenge the Biden campaign was having is that cohort of younger voters that are likely to vote for the Democratic nominee were not feeling as enthusiastic about Joe Biden because of his age. And maybe that shifted a little with Kamala Harris. And so looking at both of the candidates, younger voters are like, they both seem old, but now maybe there's a slight difference in their minds because Kamala Harris has enrolled a number of younger celebrities and recognizable cultural icons to come out in support of her campaign, in addition to Taylor Swift. I'm not sure who any of these people are. Apparently one of them called Kamala Harris a brat, and that's a good thing. I mean, it's just lost on me, Travis. Maybe you know what that means, but it makes a difference, I guess, to young people.
Like all great slang, it has no true discernible meaning. I find the chart there, young women are more concerned about major issues than young men, very interesting. If you look down at the bottom, the only one where it flips is immigration, where young men are more interested about the issue than young women. You also see the young women are becoming more liberal chart, also interesting. As you kind of contemplate the information in those two charts, I would suggest to you that you wonder, how are we sampling young female voters in the polling you're seeing? Every poll that you see, someone has had to decide who to ask the question to, and they weight it for factors like race, sex, party, registration, all sorts of numbers of factors. And at the end of the day, they're trying to predict not only the outcome of the election, but who will vote in that election. And I would bet you quite a lot of money that the polling you have seen has undersampled female voters, particularly young female voters, based on what turnout will actually look like when we get to November 5th. And of course, that will benefit Harris. So yeah, that's kind of a guess, but I think it's a good one.
All right, and this from the Washington Post recently this week, where Harris has made up the ground, most significantly among very likely Democratic voters, African-American women. She's picked up a lot of support, and that as a voting segment, saying they are far more interested and enthusiastic about actually participating. not quite yet back at the level of the actual performance of African-American women as voters in the 2020 election, but some momentum in a positive direction for Harris in this regard. Travis, the observation I would make, you alluded to this earlier, Harris is probably where Biden would have been without the stumble and maybe if he was 15 years younger. And so the race is probably where the race is now, as it was always going to be as of right now. It's just a slightly different dynamic because of the way Biden departed and Harris became the nominee. Do you agree?
Yeah, I think that's directionally correct, right? And kind of also Harris she's very close to having burned through all the initial momentum, like the bump from becoming the nominee, and then the bump from the convention, and now there's a bump from the debate potentially, and the rest of the election is going to kind of be about the rest of the election time, right? It's going to be about how everybody reacts. It's going to be about world events, like you said. It's going to be about policies. What can you do for me? What are you saying you'll do for me? So we're kind of entering the next stage of the election where it's a more, I don't want to say traditional, but obviously the Democrats replacing their nominee a month ago was very non-traditional. So we're going to kind of burn through some of that momentum, and it'll be about carrying it forward. I never understand, regardless of race, people who are not certain about voting one way or another. I mean, if you ask me if I'm going to work tomorrow, I may not want to, but I'm certain I'm going to. It just is so. I would love in this country if we could just get more and more people, young people in particular, just accept it as a fact of life. And if you don't like candidates, well, go help us get a better one.
We didn't talk about this. The debate that was held this week was, as of that date, the only scheduled presidential debate. It seemed like the polling that's taken place in the immediate aftermath of the debate showed a majority of the respondents felt Kamala Harris won the debate, whatever that means. But when you drill down into the numbers, the percentage of people that said it influenced their decision as to who they were going to support was relatively small. So people may have felt Harris won, but it didn't change many minds in terms of voting. At this point, it seems like there's a lot of internal discussion in the Trump campaign about whether or not to have a second debate. What do you think is going to happen?
Oh, but I stopped trying to predict what Donald Trump and the people around him would do years ago. That's too tall a task for me. But I'll guess that there is another debate. He can't say no to bait. He takes the bait almost every time. So that would be my guess. And I'll go further and say that he does much better in the second debate.
North Carolina's congressional races, talked about the specific contest here. We have 14 congressional districts now. The map that you see in front of you are the districts. The candidates that are listed there, the incumbents, their names are in italics. Their party affiliation is identified by the border of their picture. The reason that I don't include two pictures for all of these is, well, one, there's a candidate, McDowell, in the 6th district, has no opponent in the fall. So he is the winner. He will be the next congressman from the 6th district in North Carolina. But the way these districts are drawn, the historical voting patterns would indicate that the candidates indicated on this map are very likely to win those races. The only contest in a competitive congressional district is in the 1st district. Don Davis, the incumbent there, Lori Buckhout, the Republican candidate. Polling shows it to be a very close race. Two questions for you, Travis. One, any insights on this race in the 1st district? Two, do you think it matters in terms of turnout that voters don't feel their participation in any of these congressional races is likely to make a difference in the outcome?
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, that's probably not how they decide whether to go vote or not. But at the margins, maybe, yeah, for a few people. I certainly, if I can get on my soapbox about gerrymandering for a moment, I would love to see districts drawn to bring us together as opposed to separate us based on political leanings. I think a lot of the problems that we've had with fringe candidates advancing have been because of the way we draw districts, although we are somewhat limited because of where people live. Republicans are not making that up when they talk about how districts are drawn. I mean, people tend to self-select where they live. I don't have any particular insight on the Davis Buckhout race. My bet would be that Davis wins. He, I think, has done a good job of positioning himself as, pragmatic, reasonable, moderate. He has very real Eastern North Carolina roots. He was the mayor of, was it Snow Hill, Joe?
yeah.
Where,
Yep.
yeah, Don Davis, I don't know anything about his constituent services operation other than I know Don Davis and would bet that it's excellent. And I think that makes a lot of difference, even though he's only, I guess, a one-term incumbent, hasn't had a lot of time to do it. But that means a lot in a congressional race.
Well, and the interesting dynamic is we'll look next at the balance of power in the House and Senate of the United States. Even though we have no U.S. Senate race here, the current composition of our congressional delegation is 7 Democrats and 7 Republicans. And because of the way the maps were drawn, we will now be sending a larger contingent of Republicans to Congress. The ultimate balance of power in the U.S. House of Representatives may be impacted beneficially to Republicans, at least in part as a result of what happened here in North Carolina in terms of redistricting.
Right. I mean, it may be enough to make up the whole difference, right? I mean, it may be enough to decide control of the House.
And so here is the map of the U.S. Senate and House of Representative races. As you can see, these are predictions based on polling data and other information. No U.S. Senate race in North Carolina again, as we said, but it looks like the Republicans stand a pretty good chance of at least capturing half of the seats in the U.S. Senate, which would make a big difference in terms of who gets elected president, because the vice president serves as the presiding officer in the U.S. Senate and would cast the tie-breaking vote in any of the anything that came before the Senate in which there wasn't 50-50 split. The U.S. House is very close right now. It looks like it's going to be really close now, really close after this election. North Carolina's contribution to the total number of Republicans notwithstanding, it seems pretty likely that we could end up with split government like we have now, and we have a split Congress as of now as a result of the dynamic of having a vice president who is a Democrat in a 50-50 split U.S. Senate. But so the next election is always what matters after this election, Travis, and the 2026 midterms are just around the corner. And usually the first midterm after a presidential election goes against the party in control of the White House. We will have a U.S. Senate race. Tom Tillis will be up for re-election in 2026. Any insights about what the possible outcomes of all of these races on a national level might mean and what the landscape for 2026 might look like?
Well, nationally, I'll be interested to see how long Mitch McConnell continues as he's getting up there in age of the Senate. How long does he continue to be the Senate Majority Leader? Even though I expect Republicans to continue to hold the Senate, will we see some sort of passing of the torch sooner rather than later? I have no insight onto that. When it comes to 2026 in North Carolina, I think that if Mark Robinson loses the governor's race this year on November 5th, then on November 6th, he becomes the front runner for the Republican nomination of the 2026 United States Senate race, even over Tillis, the incumbent. Just the way the Republican Party primaries have worked and the candidates that they've nominated, Robinson has been one of the most popular Republicans among Republicans in North Carolina, and I think that's probably what he ends up doing. So if you want my look ahead to 2026, I think it's probably Robinson v. Tillis.
Interesting. All right, so moving on to the state legislative races. This is the partisan composition of the various House and Senate districts. Not an absolute predictor of an outcome, but based on the fact that voters in that particular part of the state have tended to support candidates of one party or another, gives us a pretty good sense of the partisan disposition that's likely to influence the outcome of these elections. The way that the districts are drawn and this relative partisan identity of voters there, the Republicans hold supermajorities in both the state House and Senate, meaning they have enough votes to override a gubernatorial veto on a party line vote, 30 in the Senate and 72 in the House. It looks at this point that the only question is, can the Republicans retain a supermajority? They will, in all likelihood, maintain an absolute majority, both House and Senate, after these elections. The only question seems to be whether they can get to supermajorities in both chambers. Looking at the state Senate, this is the partisan disposition of voters in the various of the 50 Senate districts. There are 3, and it's interesting, I included in this recently a nonprofit, nonpartisan political research group, the Free Enterprise Foundation, put out this information, and it's a look at the trend in these districts that are so competitive. And as you can see, these 3 Senate districts that are considered to be the really hot competitive districts, you have two Republicans running for reelection, Michael Lee in a district in New Hanover County and Lisa Barnes in the Johnston County area. Barnes's district has been trending Republican. It's slightly Republican now. Michael Lee's district is Republican leaning, but has been trending Democratic. And then an open seat race in Wake County, even though it's considered a toss-up district, it has been trending Democratic over the last couple of election cycles. And the star indicates where in North Carolina those three districts are. Any insights on the Senate, Travis?
Not so much on the Senate. I mean, I think they continue to hold the supermajority Republicans do in the Senate. The question is the House.
And then turning to the House, the same information from the Free Enterprise Foundation in some of these districts, not all, but about 7 of them or so. The trend lines are some indication of what's likely to happen. I think the one race that seems most significant in terms of the Republicans trying to maintain supermajority, Tricia Cotham, a Democrat who became a Republican, a district that is slightly leaning Republican, but trending Democratic, Mecklenburg County. Her mother, Pat Cotham, who was a county commissioner, got thrown out by the voters there, I think in part in response to what her daughter, Tricia Cotham, had done in changing parties. But it just seems there's enough different House races. It's less likely the House can get to supermajority. It's not impossible, but a lot more things would have to happen, I think, for the House to be able to get to the 72. You agree, Travis?
That's the general wisdom, yeah, and that the Republicans fall just short in the House. Although I will say the political machines that House Republicans and Senate Republicans have is very well run. I tend not to bet against them, and that's no shade on the Democratic operation. I just happen to be a little more familiar with the Republican one because they've been in the majority. But they do a very good job, and they always feel very competent. And have surprised me in the past. So I wouldn't be surprised if the supermajorities survived in both chambers, but I'd guess they fall one-ish seat short in the House.
No, I agree. And the fact that the Republicans have supermajorities at this point makes their fundraising prowess a little greater than their Democratic counterparts, which means money can be put into these highly competitive districts. In looking at the ones that are either in metropolitan areas or on the cusp, the voters there are highly compacted as a result of that phenomena and a little easier to reach. The only difference may be the trend in the presidential contest or the gubernatorial contest might have a slightly different impact on a more metropolitan district for a Republican candidate than it might a more rural district. So we'll see. But I think it will be very close. Again, one of those dynamics of this election to which we assign that expression, it's going to be close.
Yeah, and if Republicans do lose that supermajority, the lame duck session that they hold in late November or early December this year is going to be a doozy.
Yeah, no, absolutely. If they come back into session, they'll still have the supermajorities they enjoy now, be able to override a veto that a lame duck Governor Cooper might impose upon them even before the start of the next session, which is not until late January of next year. Just again, looking at the state House districts, because that's they're smaller so there's smaller in population, so there's a greater number of them. You could see the population trends and the way that partisan affiliation of voters in particular parts of the state is really taken on that urban versus rural dynamic in North Carolina now. All right, moving to the statewide races. Council of State, 10 executive branch offices that are on the ballot. 7 are sort of open seat races, some odd ones like the auditor's race. Jessica Holmes was appointed to the seat, so she's running, even though she's never run for the office before. Michelle Morrow, the superintendent candidate for the Republicans, beat the incumbent Republican, Catherine Truitt. So it's kind of an interesting dynamic in that race as well. But looking at the top of the ballot, going down the ballot, of course, the races that we are most interested in for this organization, the insurance commissioner's race, we've done a lot. And if you go to the website where we have the interviews, both of the candidates will be speaking at our trade show next week in Winston-Salem. We put a lot of emphasis around making sure that our members are hearing from these candidates what they consider to be the important issues that they hope to accomplish should they be elected commissioner, and their focus on things that really are relevant to the insurance industry as well as agents individually. But Travis, looking at any of these statewide races, any observations?
Just a handful of things. Y'all, so the North Carolina Chamber of Commerce put something out after the Republican primary, basically saying, "Hey, we're really concerned about some of these Republican candidates," and they singled out Michelle Morrow, who, among other things, had called for the public execution of Barack Obama. She is a pretty extreme candidate by any measure, and they had lumped in Luke Farley with that, who's running for labor commissioner. Chamber has since backed off of that, said, "Hey, we met with Farley. We actually think quite a lot of them." I'm interested in that race, in part because Braxton Winston, who's running against Luke Farley, is kind of a young, up and coming. He's not that young, but he's an up and coming Democrat from the Charlotte area. He's an excellent communicator. He really is talking about using that position as to advocate for workers. He is kind of one of those kind of future of the Democratic Party guys. So I'm kind of interested in that race. Also, the Jackson Bishop race. I cannot think maybe of two more opposing forces to be running against each other there. In the Morrow Green race, Morrow has been polling, even with some of the things that she said that are quite outlandish, almost neck and neck with Green. Sometimes she's a little above, sometimes she's a little below. But I think that's more about people not knowing anything about that race and not knowing about her or Green for that matter. So I think that changes significantly the polling in that race between now and November 5th.
And here's the aggregation of all the polling that's been conducted in the governor's race. You can see Josh Stein, the Democratic candidate, with an average of more than 9 percentage point advantage over Robinson, the Republican. The performance, the final results in the last two gubernatorial contests. At this point, it looks like Stein is up enough for the race to be at least not declared as competitive as maybe people thought it would be at the start of the election cycle. Travis, it seems likely that this race compresses as we get closer to election day, but any observations in the governor's race and what the impact of this contest might be on some of those other statewide?
Yeah, those numbers will come down a little bit, I would think. Three things that I'm watching for as we go forward. One, does Trump distance himself from Robinson? Does he think he sees the hand right out of the wall and just kind of pull back from Mark Robinson? He even just kind of quietly he quiet quits maybe on his endorsement there. Two, I think you see from this chart that in a state that tends to lean just a little bit Republican, the Republican Party has not done a good job of finding an electable candidate for governor the last few cycles. And then three, you see the Roy Cooper effect we talked about earlier, where he runs a little bit ahead of other Democrats, partly or largely because of his support in rural communities. And that's something that's going away for Democrats. So how do they make that up? Does the new head of the Democratic Party, Anderson Clayton, does her push for in rural areas, does it make up that percentage that they have relied on to win the governor's office for a few cycles now?
And then looking at the Council of State, these 10 executive branch offices, including U.S. Senate, when there was a U.S. Senate race, because that's a statewide contest, and going back over time, you can see the party that won the office in each of these elections. The darker line between 2012 and 2016 is when North Carolina removed straight ticket voting as an option, and people could no longer just push one button in effect and vote for all of the party's candidates down the ballot. And we see that in the 2016 election, the first time people had the ability to go down the ballot and vote in these individual races, Republicans did better. There was a little back and forth going on. Someone may vote for the Republican candidate for agriculture commissioner, but the Democratic candidate for Secretary of State. Not a large number of people, but enough of a significant portion of that group of voters in the middle to make a difference in the outcome. So looking at these races now, I've indicated the winners from the 2020, the party that won, and in which of the races this year are open seat races and which incumbents are running again. Travis, any takeaways from any of that?
Just that you've only got incumbents in three of them, right? I mean, obviously, forget about the United States Senate; that's not up there. But insurance, agriculture, and Secretary of State is the only three with incumbents. So we're going to turn over 7 of our 10 Council of State seats. And in a year where Democrats may run ahead of what you'd expect, I don't know about a wave here, but you could very well see more Democrats than they would otherwise expect to be able to put into these Council of State seats.
And then, of course, there are judicial contests on the ballot, as we mentioned earlier. 1 state Supreme Court seat up, and then 3 appellate court seats. The partisan balance is not in play. Current composition of the state Supreme Court, 5 Republican justices and 2 Democrats. So regardless of how this one turns out, Republicans will still hold a majority of the seats. In the appellate courts, it's not as relevant, the number of Republicans and Democrats, but still Republicans hold a significant majority of the 15 members of the state Court of Appeals. Travis, these races generally don't attract a lot of attention. Sometimes outside money plays a more significant part than what the candidates themselves are able to raise and spend in support of their own candidacies. Any thoughts or observations on any of those races?
Yeah, I think outside of a scandal, the races like this tend to go to chalk. You know, they tend to be more about this is Allison Riggs versus Jefferson Griffin, but really it's generic Republican versus generic Democrat. And any problems that Mark Robinson is causing for Republicans by being at the top of the ballot and running below where he should, I think that effect fades as you go down the ballot. And this is pretty far down the ballot, and you kind of go back to voting for the Republican or the Democrat. I wonder how many people, if any, will be voting because they say, all right, well, the General Assembly is controlled by Republicans and they pass the laws. I don't want the Supreme Court to be so controlled by Republicans that they kind of turn into a rubber stamp, which is the accusation they face from some. So I'm going to vote for the Democrat. I don't know that people are doing that calculus or really any calculus as they decide how to vote for judges. I mean, how to put judges on the bench is one of those questions that vexes states all across the country because, you know, people will say, oh, it's a terrible idea to appoint them, but at least it's better than electing them, or vice versa. You know, no one can really decide what the best way is to decide who the judges are.
Well, that wraps up the evaluation of the individual races. I'm glad to answer any questions. If you want to put those in the comment field, we'll track that a little bit. Travis, I'll give you a few minutes. Any summarizing thoughts or overview that you would want to provide here as we wrap things up?
No, I think we went pretty in depth there. And of course, you know, this could go all out the window next week. That is the nature of time and how it advances. The people talk about October surprises for a very good reason. And I'm sure there are some that are planned. I mean, that somewhere there is a political consultant just sitting on something, just waiting to pull the trigger on it. And we don't know what it is, but it could change things.
Well, we do know that there will continue to be a pretty considerable expenditure of money in the presidential contest here in North Carolina as we remain apparently a battleground state in the presidential contest. So if you own a TV station or in the business of selling ads and social media and digital platforms, you're going to make a lot of money this election cycle in North Carolina. Again, we will make the recording of this webinar available on the website. That's IIANC.com/2024 elections. And we'll be pushing out that link tomorrow. We'll have a special edition of the Raleigh Report, the publication that we send out each Friday in the legislative session, where we had a gathering of legislators this week. We didn't talk about it in the context of this webinar, but we'll cover it's nothing really insurance related per se, but we'll cover a summary of what transpired earlier this week in the General Assembly and include the link to this webinar. A big shout out to Travis Fain. Thanks so much for joining me, Travis.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
And that's all we have for today. Again, thank you for taking time to be a part of this webinar. We probably will do one more of these, maybe in the final week before the election, just to offer any insights that we have heading up to Election Day. Have a great rest of your day. And for those of you that are planning to attend next week's Insure Expo, I look forward to seeing you there.